In the autumn of 1891, in a forgotten stretch of southwestern Kansas, a bounty hunter tracking a horse thief stumbled upon an abandoned wagon. It was a surveyor's wagon, its canvas cover shredded by the relentless wind, its wheels half sunk in the hardened mud of a long-dead creek bed. Inside, amidst the smell of sun-baked leather and dry rot, he found the usual tools of the trade, a transit, chains, and stacks of neatly rolled maps. But he also found two other items. The first was a master survey map of the territory, its surface covered in hundreds of precisely plotted homesteads. Dozens of these claims, scattered across 3 territories, were marked with a small, stark, black X. The second item was a leather-bound ledger, a surveyor's field journal. Its pages were filled not with measurements and topographical notes, but with names, dates, and a chilling, clinical vocabulary. Beside each name that corresponded to a black X on the map was a single, scrawled annotation: "Claim cleared." Authorities would later discover that over the preceding 12 years, more than 800 men, women, and children who had settled on those marked claims had vanished from the face of the earth. Their disappearances were written off as the grim, ordinary attrition of the West: starvation, disease, abandonment. But the surveyor's journal told a different story. It was a meticulously kept record of death, a ledger of murder engineered with a precision that was both brilliant and breathtakingly evil. This wasn't misfortune. This was a culling, a systematic cleansing of the land, orchestrated by a company America trusted to build its future. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of American history. If you're ready to hear stories that others dare not tell, stories that will make you question what really happened in the shadows of our past, then subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, from which state are you listening to this story? Leave a comment below telling us your location. To understand the horror of the Fletcher family and their Western expansion and survey company, you must first understand the dream they perverted. The late 1870s were the crucible of the American West. The nation, healing from a civil war, looked to the horizon with a feverish, almost religious zeal known as manifest destiny. The government, through the Homestead Act, offered a promise that seemed almost too good to be true: 160 acres of land, free to any soul brave enough to tame it. This promise drew hundreds of thousands from the crowded, dirty cities of the East and the ravaged farms of the South. There were farmers, craftsmen, veterans, and immigrants, all chasing a phantom of self-sufficiency. But the West was not a gentle host. It was an unforgiving sea of grass, where the summers scorched the earth and the winters buried it in snow. Isolation was a constant, crushing presence. A letter could take months to reach the family back east, if it reached them at all. In this world, a single well was the difference between life and a slow, agonizing death. Water was the linchpin of survival, the sacred source around which a family's entire future was built. And the railroad was the god of this new world. It was the artery of commerce, the harbinger of civilization, and the ultimate arbiter of a piece of land's value. Land near a proposed railway line wasn't just land. It was a future. It was a fortune. And every homesteader who hammered a stake into that valuable soil was, to some, an obstacle. A sepia-toned, posed photograph of a severe-looking man in his late 40s appears. He has a trimmed beard, cold eyes, and wears an expensive suit. This is Josiah Fletcher. Into this landscape of desperate hope and immense greed stepped Josiah Fletcher. To the public, Fletcher was a titan of progress. His firm, the Western Expansion and Survey Company, founded in 1879 and operating out of a respectable 2-story brick building in Dodge City, Kansas, was a name synonymous with manifest destiny. They held lucrative contracts with the major railroad conglomerates, tasked with charting the vast, unorganized territories. They were the men who drew the maps that became the future. They decided where towns would rise and where they would not. Fletcher was not a product of the frontier. He was a creature of the Eastern boardroom, a man who saw the West not as a landscape of human struggle, but as a ledger book. The pioneers, in his eyes, were not people. They were variables, inconvenient, unpredictable numbers on a balance sheet. His private journals, seized after the discovery of the wagon, reveal a mind of chilling detachment. He never wrote of murder, of families, or of suffering. He wrote of clearing claims, of rectifying settlement errors, and of optimizing assets. The pioneers who settled on land the railroad secretly wanted were, in his own words, a contamination to be purged. At first, the company's methods were predatory but legal. Fletcher's agents would use their inside knowledge of future railroad routes to intimidate or swindle homesteaders. They would file competing, fraudulent claims, burying a poor farmer in legal fees he couldn't possibly afford. They would offer to buy a family's claim for pennies on the dollar, whispering warnings of coming hardships, Indian raids, or drought, hardships their company would later create. But this process was slow. It was inefficient. Stubborn families, those who had poured their blood and sweat into the unforgiving soil, often refused to yield. They believed in the American dream with a tenacity that Josiah Fletcher found irritating. It was in the winter of 1879, after a German family named Schmidt refused to abandon their well-watered claim along the planned Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, that Fletcher's calculus shifted. His journal entry from December 5th of that year is stark. Resistance on parcel 44B is costing us valuable time. The obstinacy of the settler is a liability. A more permanent solution is required. A final solution. He realized that a grieving family was easier to swindle than a stubborn one, and a dead family left no one to swindle at all. The claim simply became empty, abandoned, ready to be refiled, reassessed, and sold to the railroad for 1,000% profit. The Western Expansion and Survey Company was no longer just in the business of drawing maps. It was now in the business of creating ghosts. And to do this, Josiah Fletcher needed men who were not afraid to get their hands dirty. He needed men who could walk onto a family's homestead, smile, offer them the promise of water, and instead deliver a plague. He needed the dowsers. Josiah Fletcher understood that to reshape the world, one needed the right instruments. For his vast and monstrous work, a simple gun or a knife would be crude, vulgar. Such tools left evidence. They spoke of struggle. Fletcher required instruments of a higher, more sinister caliber. He needed men who could wield hope as a weapon, who could turn a family's prayers against them. He needed men who could perform a miracle and leave a plague in its wake. He called them his dowsers. They were two brothers, Caleb and Elias Thorne, and to a desperate family, isolated by 100 miles of unforgiving prairie, their arrival on the horizon looked like an act of divine providence. Caleb, the elder, was the face of the operation. He was a master of the frontier's fragile psychology. He had a preacher's warm smile and a way of speaking that seemed to sand the rough edges off a hard life. He could read a family in an instant, see the exhaustion in the father's eyes, the fear in the mother's, the hollow hunger in the children. He knew which Bible verses offered the most comfort, and he delivered them not as a sermon, but as a shared confidence, as if he too were a weary traveler leaning on the grace of God. Elias was something else entirely. He was the silent engine of the partnership. Gaunt, with eyes that seemed to be constantly measuring distances, he was the living embodiment of the prairie's unsettling emptiness. When he walked, he made almost no sound. His focus was absolute, unnerving. While Caleb disarmed the homesteaders with scripture and sympathy, Elias would be observing the homestead itself, the layout of the cabin, the health of the livestock, and most importantly, the location and state of the family's well. He was not a man, he was a diagnosis. The scene is reenacted in a stark, high-contrast style. A lone sod house. The Thorne brothers are sharing a meager meal with a family, the Millers. The firelight flickers on their faces. The Millers, hopeful. Caleb, beatific. Elias, avoid. Their method was a ritual of profound betrayal. They would arrive at a targeted homestead, say the Miller family on their 160 acres along Plum Creek, and Caleb would begin his performance. He would speak of their shared hardships. He would praise the family's courage. He would offer to have his brother, a man gifted by the Lord, douse for a new vein of water or purify their existing well. He asked for no money. A hot meal and a moment of prayer with fellow Christians is payment enough for us, he would say. It was an act of sacred theater. The family, starved for human contact and desperate for relief, would welcome them in. They would share their bread, their water. They would bow their heads as Caleb led them in a prayer for deliverance, his warm voice filling the small sod house. And as they prayed, Elias would slip outside. This was the dark sacrament. At the well, the heart of the family's existence, Elias would unpack his worn leather satchel. He would lay out his tools with the precision of a surgeon. The dividing rod was a prop. The true work was done with a length of weighted cord and a small, corked vial. Inside the vial, supplied by Fletcher at $50 apiece, was a concentrated culture of cholera. Elias's gloved hand uncorking the vial. A wisp of foul air seems to escape. He attaches it to the cord. He would explain to the family, should they be watching, that he was merely taking a sample to test its purity or measuring the depth. Then, with the family's hopeful eyes upon him, he would lower the vial into the darkness of their well. A gentle tug on the cord, and the stopper would release. The culture would bloom invisibly in the cool, clear water, a dark baptism from which there was no recovery. He would then withdraw the line, pack his satchel, and nod to Caleb. The performance was complete. The brothers would thank the family for their hospitality, offer one final blessing for their future prosperity, and ride off into the sunset, leaving behind a ticking clock of biological horror. The patriarch of the Miller family, a man named Thomas, wrote a single entry in his diary that evening, the last he would ever write. "Two men of God, the brothers Thorne, stopped with us today. A true blessing. Elias has cleansed our well. I feel our fortunes are set to turn. Mary is already planning a garden for the spring. There would be no spring garden for Mary Miller. Within 36 hours, the cleansing would begin. A violent, agonizing sickness that ripped through the family, turning their small home into a charnel house. It was a death so complete, so isolating, that no one would find them for months. The screen shows a page from Fletcher's ledger. The name Miller T is visible. Next to it, in neat cursive, is the date, and the words claim cleared, payment issued, $200. Back in Dodge City, a coded telegram would inform Josiah Fletcher that the work was done. He would open his master ledger, a book that should be considered one of the most monstrous documents in American history, and with the steady hand of a corporate accountant, he would draw a line through a family's name. Account settled. For the price of 2 vials of poison and a 200 feet to his dowsers, 15,000, to the railroad. For 12 years, this unholy trinity of commerce, science, and false piety operated flawlessly. Fletcher provided the maps and the motive. The disgraced doctor in St. Louis provided the pestilence. And the Thorne brothers, the specters of the plains, delivered it with a prayer and a smile. They were a self-contained, self-sustaining ecosystem of death, erasing family after family, turning the American dream into a mass grave. But even the most meticulous plans can be undone by the most human of emotions. Not greed, not fear, but love. And in 1888, a young woman in Boston named Rebecca Morrison received a letter from her brother, settled in the Nebraska Territory. It was filled with hope, speaking of his new wife, their bountiful first harvest, and the kindness of 2 traveling dowsers who had helped them fix their well. It was the last letter she would ever receive, and Rebecca Morrison was not the kind of woman to accept silence as an answer. Her stubborn, unshakable love would become the first tremor in an earthquake that would bring Josiah Fletcher's entire empire of death crashing down. A woman's hands, elegant and uncalloused, folding a letter. The room is well appointed, suggesting a Boston apartment. Sunlight streams through a lace curtain. The atmosphere is one of order and quiet grief. In the ledgers of Josiah Fletcher, the family of Daniel Morrison was just another entry. Claim cleared. Parcel 71G, Nebraska Territory. A simple transaction, one of dozens that year. Fletcher had erased them and moved on, but he had made a critical miscalculation. He had failed to account for the one force more persistent than his own greed, a sister's love. Her name was Rebecca Morrison, and she lived in a world 1,000 miles and 1,000,000 lifetimes away from the sod-house frontier. She was a woman of Boston, a teacher of literature, a creature of logic, letters, and civil order. She was not a fainting violet. Her mind had been sharpened on books and intellectual debate. And when the lively, hope-filled letters from her younger brother Daniel suddenly stopped in the summer of 1888, she did not accept the silence. To her, it was not an absence of noise. It was a presence, a living, screaming void that demanded an explanation. Her brother's last letter was a portrait of joy. He spoke of his new wife, Sarah, of the rich soil, of the well that was now, thanks to 2 kind dowsers who had passed through, producing the sweetest water he'd ever tasted. He promised he would send for her to visit the following spring. That spring came and went with no word. Then the summer. Then the autumn, a montage of letters being written and mailed. We see Rebecca's neat, determined handwriting, then the weathered, indifferent facade of a frontier post office. Rebecca began her campaign not with a journey, but with ink and paper. She wrote to the postmaster in the nearest settlement to Daniel's claim. The reply, when it came 3 months later, was short and unhelpful. The Morrisons hadn't collected mail in months. He assumed they had moved on. "It happens all the time, ma'am," she wrote to the county sheriff. His response was even more dismissive. He was responsible for a territory the size of Rhode Island, with 2 deputies. He couldn't go chasing after every family that decided to pack up and seek their fortune elsewhere. "Folks out here are a restless sort," he wrote. "Your brother likely got California fever," she wrote to the federal land office. This reply was the most chilling of all. It was a sterile bureaucratic form letter. It stated that the claim filed by Daniel Morrison in 1887 had been officially declared abandoned due to lack of activity in September of 1888. The land had subsequently been resurveyed and sold to a private investment group. Case closed. Abandonment. The word was an insult. It didn't align with anything she knew of her brother's character or with the vibrant hope of his final letter. People who were planning a garden for the spring did not simply vanish. People who had just had their well cleansed by a supposed act of charity did not walk away from it. Frustrated and stonewalled by an indifferent bureaucracy, Rebecca did something radical for a woman of her time and station. She used a small inheritance to hire a correspondence clerk in Omaha, a man who, for a fee, would act as her agent. She had him retrieve a copy of every document related to her brother's claim. The parcel he sent back changed everything. Inside was a copy of the deed of sale for Daniel's land. The signature on the bottom, purporting to be his, was a crude, clumsy forgery. A child could see it. Even more damning was the name of the surveyor who had signed the abandonment certificate just weeks after Daniel's last letter. The seal at the bottom of the document was ornate, professional. It read, "The Western Expansion and Survey Company, J. Fletcher, proprietor." It was the first time she had seen the name. A solid, respectable name. A thread. The scene shifts, contrasting Rebecca's lonely, lamplit investigation with the world of Josiah Fletcher. We see Fletcher in a fine suit, dedicating a new public library in Dodge City. He smiles, shakes hands with the mayor. He is a celebrated civic leader. While Rebecca Morrison was piecing together the ghost of her brother's life in Boston, Josiah Fletcher was cementing his legacy in Kansas. The profits from his silent, bloody enterprise were immense. By 1889, the company was clearing over 100 claims a year, generating profits that would be equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today. This blood money was laundered into legitimacy. Fletcher became a philanthropist. He financed churches, built schools, and sat on the board of 3 different banks. He was the very picture of the self-made man who had helped build the West. He moved through the world with the serene confidence of a man who believed he was not a murderer, but an architect of destiny. His ledger books, hidden in a false-bottomed safe in his office, told the real story. But to the world, he was a hero. His greatest deception was not the poisoning of the wells, but the construction of his own public virtue. He had become so successful, so insulated by wealth and power, that he had forgotten the one variable that can undo any equation: a single, determined human being who will not let go. Rebecca is in her Boston apartment. It is clear she has made a decision. Her books are being packed into crates. She holds a train ticket in her hand. Her face is set, resolute. For Rebecca Morrison, the forged signature was proof. The official narrative was a lie. Her brother and his wife hadn't abandoned their dream, they had been stolen from it. And the name on the surveyor's certificate was the only clue she had. She sold her teaching contract. She liquidated her father's inheritance. She packed one trunk with simple, durable clothes, and another with every letter, every document, every map she possessed. In the spring of 1890, Rebecca Morrison boarded a train heading west. She was a woman of letters, stepping out of the library and into the slaughterhouse. She didn't know what she would find. She didn't know the name of the Thorne brothers or the true horrific nature of the company she was investigating. She only knew a name, Fletcher, and a profound, unshakable certainty that she was traveling toward an evil far deeper than a simple land swindle. She was on a collision course with the man who ran the most prolific murder-for-profit scheme in American history, and she was going alone. The journey from Boston to the Nebraska Territory was a journey between worlds. For Rebecca Morrison, the neat, ordered grid of city streets gave way to an endless, terrifying expanse of sky and grass. This was the world that had swallowed her brother. Looking out the window, she began to understand the profound isolation that made the crimes she suspected possible. Out here, a family could simply cease to be, and the world would roll on, indifferent. She arrived not as a grieving sister, but as a meticulous researcher. She established a base in Omaha, presenting herself as a historian writing a book on the settlement of the plains. It was a plausible cover, granting her access to land offices, newspaper archives, and the gossiping hubs of frontier towns without raising suspicion. She was a lone woman, but she armed herself with knowledge. She learned to read plat maps. She memorized the bureaucratic pathways of land claims. And in every office, in every archive, she looked for one name, the Western Expansion and Survey Company. And she found it, everywhere. A montage of documents, land deeds, survey maps, abandonment notices. On each one, the company's seal is prominent. Rebecca's finger traces over the name, J. Fletcher. The company was like a ghost in the machine of westward expansion. Its name was attached to dozens, then hundreds of abandoned claims across 3 territories. Using her research funds, Rebecca hired local correspondents to discreetly visit a handful of these sites. The reports that came back were eerily similar. A decaying sod house, an overgrown field, and in every single case, a well that locals said had gone bad, sparking a sudden catastrophic illness that had wiped out the family. Cholera, dysentery, summer fever. The diagnoses varied, but the pattern was undeniable. It was a pattern of perfectly timed tragedy. A family settles on valuable land. Their well fails. They die or disappear. The Western Expansion and Survey Company certifies the abandonment. The land is sold. Rebecca began to compile a new set of maps. Not survey maps, but maps of death. On a large map of the territories spread across the floor of her small rented room, she began to place pins. A red pin for a claim certified by Fletcher's company. A black pin for a claim where an entire family had been wiped out by a sudden waterborne illness. Soon her map was a constellation of red and black, and the two colors almost always appeared together. She discovered something else, a detail that made the hair on her arms stand up. In the archives of local newspapers, she found small passing mentions, often in the society pages or travel logs, of two men, a pair of brothers known as itinerant dowsers, who traveled the plains offering to help settlers find water. Their names were rarely mentioned, but their reputation for piety and kindness was. And their travels, when she could trace them, seemed to correspond with horrifying accuracy to the clusters of black pins on her map. They were phantoms, but they were phantoms who left a trail of graves. The scene shifts to Dodge City, a close-up on Josiah Fletcher's face. He is older now, more confident, but there is a flicker of irritation in his eyes. He is reading a letter. While Rebecca was connecting the dots in Nebraska, Josiah Fletcher was dealing with a problem of his own. His perfect, sterile system was developing a flaw, not a moral flaw. That was a concept alien to him, but a practical one. His instruments, the Thorne brothers, were becoming unstable. 12 years of committing the same intimate atrocity had taken its toll, but not in the way one might expect. They hadn't developed a conscience. They had developed a taste for it. The performance, the power of holding a family's life in their hands, had become a narcotic. They were becoming less careful, more theatrical. Caleb's sermons were becoming more fiery, Elias's silences more menacing. They started referring to their work in their coded telegrams not as a job, but as a cleansing, a purification. They had started to believe their own performance. They saw themselves not as murderers for hire, but as avenging angels purging the land of the weak. In a letter to his contact in St. Louis, Fletcher complained, "The assets have become compromised by their own mythology. Their zeal is endangering the enterprise. They are drawing attention." He was a businessman managing a bloody portfolio, and his agents were becoming liabilities. He began to make plans to retire them, to pay them a final, handsome sum, and dissolve the partnership. It was a decision he should have made years earlier. Just when everything seems to be coming to a head in this terrifying tale of the American plains, I want to pause for a moment. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. The truth about what happened next is even more shocking than what we've uncovered so far. We have an investigator who is closing in on the truth, and a pair of killers who are beginning to spin out of control. Let's discover together how this house of horrors finally came crashing down. By the winter of 1890, Rebecca Morrison knew she was not investigating a simple case of fraud. The scale of it, the sheer number of pins on her map, pointed to something far more monstrous. She had the pattern. She had the name of the company. She suspected the method, but she had no proof that would stand up in a court of law. She had a tapestry of circumstance and a litany of ghosts. She needed a witness. Or she needed a confession. She made the decision to travel to the heart of the web, Dodge City, Kansas, the home of the Western Expansion and Survey Company. It was an incredibly dangerous move. She would be stepping into the territory of the man she was certain was a mass murderer, a man with deep connections, a sterling reputation, and the financial resources to crush anyone who became a threat. But Rebecca had one advantage. Fletcher had no idea she existed. She was a ghost hunting a ghost. In the early spring of 1891, armed with her research and a desperate, cold courage, she boarded another train, this one bound for the dusty, violent heart of Kansas. Her plan was to pose as a wealthy widow from the East, looking to make a significant investment in railroad land. She would seek a personal meeting with the celebrated titan of industry himself, Mr. Josiah Fletcher. She would walk into the lion's den, look the killer in the eye, and hope she could find a way to make him reveal himself before he realized he was speaking to the sister of one of his hundreds of victims. Dodge City in 1891 was the beating, bloody heart of the New West. It was a city built on cattle, railroads, and relentless ambition, and no man cast a longer shadow over it than Josiah Fletcher. To arrive here with the intent of accusing him of anything was like walking into a cathedral to accuse the Pope of heresy. His name was carved into the stone of the library. It adorned the letterhead of the city's most powerful bank. It was whispered with reverence by men hoping to make their fortune. Rebecca Morrison, under the alias of Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a widow from Philadelphia, moved with calculated precision. She took a suite in the finest hotel. Let it be known she was the executor of a vast estate, and began making quiet inquiries about large-scale land investments. She was patient. She knew that in a city this hungry for capital, it was only a matter of time before the biggest shark in the water came to her. It took less than a week. An engraved card was delivered to her room. An invitation to dine, from the desk of Mr. Josiah Fletcher. The scene reenacts the dinner. It is in a private, opulent dining room. Fletcher is charming, powerful, the perfect gentleman. Rebecca, as Mrs. Vance, is poised and intelligent, playing her part flawlessly. The meeting was a masterclass in deception from both sides of the table. Fletcher saw a golden opportunity, a wealthy, naive widow ripe for the plucking. He spoke of progress, of the inevitable march of civilization, of the sacred duty to tame the land. He spoke of the railroad as a great artery, and of his company as the surgeons who ensured its healthy flow. Rebecca listened, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was dining with the man who had ordered her brother's death. She looked into his eyes, the eyes of a celebrated civic leader, and saw only the cold, dead calculation of a predator. She steered the conversation with subtle skill toward the risks of investment. She spoke of abandoned claims, of the fickle nature of the frontier. "I have heard stories, Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice steady, "of entire families who simply disappear. It must be a great loss to the territory." Fletcher's smile didn't waver. "The prairie is a harsh mistress, Mrs. Vance," he replied smoothly. "It has a way of weeding out those who lack the fortitude to master it. It is a natural, if tragic, part of the process. A clearing of the slate, so to speak, for those with the vision to truly build." A clearing of the slate. The phrase landed like a punch. It echoed the language from his own stolen correspondence. Rebecca felt a chill snake down her spine. He was confessing, in his own arrogant, detached way, right to her face. But it was not a confession that would ever hold up in court. She needed more. The scene shifts. A dusty, sun-baked trail. The Thorne brothers are on horseback. They look ragged, their eyes wild. Caleb is preaching to an empty prairie. Elias is staring at his own hands. As Fletcher was dining in luxury, his instruments were beginning to rust. The Thorne brothers were unraveling. Fletcher's attempts to retire them had been met with a new, terrifying fanaticism. They refused to stop. They sent him rambling, scripture-laced letters claiming their work was a divine mandate, that they were God's winnowing fork. They had gone from being his assets to his tormentors. Their sloppiness was becoming legendary. They were no longer subtle. They lingered in towns after a cleansing, their behavior erratic. In a saloon near the Cimarron River, a drunken Caleb had boasted of being able to make the bitter waters sweet and the sweet waters bitter. Elias, in a rare moment of speech, had terrified a blacksmith by describing in detail the way a man's body folds in on itself when it runs out of water. They were leaving whispers in their wake, whispers that were beginning to connect them to the strange plagues that followed their travels. It was one of these whispers that finally gave Rebecca the break she needed. Through her network of correspondence, she learned of a story from the Texas Panhandle. A homesteader, a German immigrant named Wittmann, had survived. The Whitman family had been on Fletcher's list. The Thorne brothers had performed their dark ritual, poisoning the well. But Sarah Whitman, the matriarch of the family, was a woman of deep, old-world superstitions. She had been unsettled by Elias Thorne's hollow eyes. She believed he had put a curse on their well. That evening, defying her husband's ridicule, she had secretly hauled 2 buckets of water from a small, muddy creek nearly a mile away, believing it to be untainted by the dowsers' magic. Her superstition saved her life and the lives of her children. Her husband, who drank only from the well, died in agony within 48 hours. When a circuit judge found her weeks later, she was half mad with grief, but she was alive. And she told him a story of 2 pious men who blessed her home and a well that turned to poison the next day. The judge, a practical man named Orrin Peck, dismissed it as the ravings of a grieving woman, but he noted it in his journal. Rebecca, hearing this third-hand account, knew she had found her witness. She had to find Sarah Whitman. She left Dodge City abruptly, leaving a note for a confused Josiah Fletcher that she had to attend to an urgent family matter. Her hunt had a new focus. And then, the entire conspiracy broke wide open, from a direction no one expected. In late August of 1891, the bounty hunter tracking a horse thief stumbled upon the abandoned surveyor's wagon. The horse thief had worked for the Thorne brothers before fleeing, stealing one of their wagons in the process. When the local sheriff investigated the wagon's contents, he found the maps marked with the black X's, and he found the field journal. It wasn't a confession. It was a business ledger. Page after page of names, dates, and the chilling annotation, "Claim cleared." The sheriff, a man who had heard the whispers about the Thorne brothers for years, finally understood. These weren't fevers. These weren't abandonments. This was a list of victims. The news traveled by telegraph. The discovery of the death wagon became a sensation. The authorities in Dodge City, led by the very sheriff Fletcher had in his pocket, had no choice but to act. They went to the offices of the Western Expansion and Survey Company with a warrant. The raid on Fletcher's office. Fletcher is dignified, indignant, demanding to see his lawyer. The sheriffs are tearing the office apart. Fletcher was the image of outraged innocence. He blustered, he threatened, he name-dropped powerful senators. He was untouchable. But one of the deputies, a young man who had long been suspicious of Fletcher's meteoric rise, noticed something odd about the heavy oak safe in the corner. He tapped on the floor plate. It rang hollow. Prying it open, they found it, the second ledger, Josiah Fletcher's master doomsday book. It was the Rosetta Stone of his entire operation. It contained the names from the field journal, but beside them were the financial details, the fees paid to the St. Louis doctor, the $200 payments to C&E Thorne, and the obscene profits from the sale of each cleared parcel of land to the railroad. Josiah Fletcher, the great philanthropist and builder of the West, stood frozen as the sheriff held up the book. The mask was gone. The architect was revealed. His empire of paper and poison had finally come crashing down. The arrest of Josiah Fletcher sent a seismic shockwave through the American West. This wasn't some back-alley thug or desperate outlaw. This was a titan, a man whose name was synonymous with progress and prosperity. The public was forced to confront a terrifying reality. The civilized world they believed was being built was, in some places, a facade, constructed over a mass grave. The institution they trusted to chart their future had been actively, systematically murdering them. Fletcher, held in the Dodge City jail, was a portrait of defiant narcissism. He refused to speak, refused to confess. He simply sat in his cell, demanding access to his lawyers and bankers, utterly convinced that his money and influence would, as they always had, make this problem disappear. He viewed his arrest not as a moral failing, but as a temporary and infuriating business complication. His ledgers, however, spoke for him. They were a cold, clear confession in copperplate script. With the architect in chains, the full weight of the law now turned to his instruments. A massive manhunt was launched for the Thorne brothers. Telegraphs clattered across the territories, carrying their descriptions and the story of their horrific crimes. They were no longer seen as pious helpers. They were now specters of death, the most wanted men in America. The scene shifts to Rebecca Morrison. She is in a dusty courthouse, speaking with the prosecutor, a weary but determined man. She places her own map, covered in pins, on his desk. And in the middle of this chaos, Rebecca Morrison finally emerged from the shadows. She presented herself to the lead prosecutor, not as the sister of a victim, but as the independent researcher who had been tracking this conspiracy for nearly 3 years. She unveiled her map of death, her meticulously compiled timelines, and her correspondence. The investigators were stunned. While they had been chasing rumors, she had built a comprehensive portrait of the entire operation. Her research filled in the gaps in Fletcher's ledgers, giving names and faces to the cold, numerical entries. Her most crucial contribution was the story of Sarah Whitman, the lone survivor of a direct attack. Rebecca's information led a team of U.S. Marshals to a remote corner of the Texas Panhandle. They found Sarah living with relatives, a haunted woman, but one whose mind was sharp and whose memory of the 2 dowsers was crystal clear. She was the living proof the prosecution desperately needed. She could place the Thorne brothers at the scene of a murder. The hunt for Caleb and Elias Thorne lasted for 6 weeks. They were ghosts on the plains they knew so well, but their reputation now preceded them. The very people they had once charmed now barred their doors in terror. They were cornered in the Badlands of the Oklahoma Territory, not by a posse, but by a simple rancher who recognized them from a flyer. Their capture was pathetic, not glorious. They were found huddled in a dry wash, starving, dehydrated, and arguing scripture. Caleb, the smooth-talking preacher, was a blubbering wreck, screaming about damnation. Elias, the silent killer, was found calmly trying to douse for water with a piece of bone, completely detached from reality. They surrendered without a fight. In their satchel, the marshals found 2 remaining vials of the cholera culture, a testament to a final cleansing they never got to perform. The trial of Josiah Fletcher and the Thorne brothers, held in the federal court in Topeka, was the sensation of the decade. It was a trial that put the very idea of manifest destiny in the dock. Rebecca Morrison was the prosecution's star witness. She took the stand, calm and articulate, and for 3 days, she laid out the entire conspiracy. She presented her maps, her timelines, and the forged deeds. She spoke not with the emotion of a grieving sister, but with the cold, irrefutable logic of an academic. She systematically dismantled Fletcher's public persona, revealing the monster beneath. Shots of the courtroom. Fletcher looked on with cold fury, Caleb Thorne weeping on the stand, Elias Thorne staring blankly into space. When Sarah Whitman testified, her simple, heartbreaking account of her husband's death silenced the entire courtroom. She pointed a trembling finger at the Thorne brothers. "They prayed with us," she wept. "They took our bread, and they put death in our well." Caleb Thorne, promised a lesser sentence, turned on his employer. His testimony was a rambling, terrifying confession, a mix of self-pity and religious delusion. He described the process in chilling detail, how Fletcher would provide them with the maps of the weak, how they would perform their ritual of trust and poison. He implicated the entire network, including the disgraced doctor in St. Louis who supplied the disease. Throughout it all, Josiah Fletcher sat impassive, as if listening to a boring business report. His defense was simple. He was a legitimate businessman, and the Thorne brothers were rogue employees whose horrific actions were unknown to him. The ledger, his lawyers argued, was simply a record of their payments for legitimate survey work. But the detail of the ledger, combined with Rebecca's evidence and Caleb's confession, was overwhelming. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty. On 87 counts of first-degree murder in the state of Kansas alone, with charges pending in 2 other territories. Rebecca Morrison leaving the courthouse. She looks not triumphant, but profoundly weary. The weight of her journey is visible on her face. Josiah Fletcher, the man who saw people as numbers, was sentenced to death by hanging. He showed no remorse, reportedly spending his final days attempting to bribe his guards. Caleb Thorne, for his cooperation, received a life sentence in prison, where he would die of syphilis 15 years later. Elias Thorne, found to be criminally insane, was committed to an asylum for the rest of his life, where he spent his days silently tracing patterns in the dust. The St. Louis doctor, implicated by Fletcher's ledger and Caleb's testimony, took his own life before he could be arrested. The Western Expansion and Survey Company was dissolved, its assets seized. The investigation revealed that the company had cleared over 800 homesteaders. More than 200 families were confirmed to have been murdered by the Thorne brothers' method. The true number will never be known. Many victims were buried in unmarked graves by their own collapsing homes, their stories ending in a forgotten patch of prairie grass. Rebecca Morrison, her duty done, returned to Boston. She never spoke publicly of the case again. She had faced the abyss and now sought only silence. But her actions had exposed a rot at the core of the American dream, proving that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who hold the maps. The hanging of Josiah Fletcher in 1892 was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of his life. The story itself, the horror he unleashed, seeped into the very soil of the American West. It became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered by old-timers, its sharp edges worn down by time until it was almost unbelievable. The sheer scale of the crime was, for many, too monstrous to be real. It was easier to forget. The aftermath of the trial was a messy, inadequate affair. The federal government, deeply embarrassed that its own homesteading program had been so easily perverted into a mechanism for mass murder, moved to quietly settle the matter. The railroad conglomerates, whose hunger for land had fueled Fletcher's entire enterprise, denied any knowledge of his methods. They pointed to their contracts with the Western Expansion and Survey Company as proof of legitimate business dealings. No high-level railroad executive was ever charged. They had been insulated by layers of paperwork and plausible deniability, a firewall built by Fletcher himself. The engine of greed that demanded the cleared land was never held to account. For the victims, there was no true justice. How could there be? The government seized Fletcher's assets, but tracing the lineage of the 800-plus souls he had erased was an impossible task. Most had come west alone, severing ties with their past. Their family lines ended in a dusty ledger book. For a few dozen families where relatives like Rebecca Morrison could be found, a meager financial settlement was paid out. But for the vast majority, their only memorial was a black X on a killer's map, now locked away in a government archive. Their 160 acres of dreams had been absorbed back into the landscape, their names forgotten by all but the wind. The legacy of this case became one of deliberate forgetting. In the grand, triumphant narrative of the American West, there was no room for a story this dark. There was no room for a celebrated philanthropist who was, in fact, the nation's most prolific serial killer. There was no room for heroes of progress who were, in reality, angel-faced assassins. And so the story was buried. The Western Expansion and Survey Company became a footnote in history books, its true nature obscured. Josiah Fletcher became a local anomaly, a grotesque outlier, rather than the logical endpoint of a system of unchecked corporate avarice. The story of Rebecca Morrison, the quiet schoolteacher who single-handedly tracked and exposed this cabal of death, was almost entirely erased. She was a woman, an outsider, and her heroic efforts complicated the official narrative of heroic lawmen taming the West. She returned to Boston and vanished from the public record, her monumental courage and brilliant investigative work relegated to a few lines in the trial transcript. She had looked into the heart of American darkness, and the nation, in its hurry to look away, forgot to thank her for it. It is tempting to look at the story of the surveyor's markers as a relic of a bygone era, a Gothic horror from a savage time, but to do so is to miss the point entirely. The methods change, but the motive remains the same. Josiah Fletcher was a pioneer, not of the land, but of a particularly modern form of evil. He never touched his victims. He sat in an office, surrounded by maps and ledgers, and dehumanized people into data points on a balance sheet. He saw human lives as liabilities and murder as clearing an account. Does that cold corporate language of detachment sound unfamiliar to our modern ears? He used a trusted institution, a survey company, as a cover for unthinkable crimes. He exploited the public's faith in progress to mask a murderous conspiracy. He understood that as long as the machine of commerce kept running, as long as profits were being made, very few people would bother to look at the human cost. The railroad got its land, the banks got their fees, the system worked. The bodies were just collateral damage. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that this kind of systematic, dehumanizing evil could still exist today, hidden behind the respectable fronts of modern corporations or institutions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling and want to hear more stories about America's hidden criminal history, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of uncovering buried truths. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that powerful people hoped would never be told.